Okay, so in this video I want to give over the 5 practical reasons why we have an oral law, why the Torah was given in this format where it had to be given over by teacher to student, parent to child, not just in the written form of the 5 books of Moses. Now in the previous session I mentioned that by definition we need an oral tradition to define what the Torah means in the written format. So as I had said, observe the Sabbath day. Well, what exactly is a Sabbath day? Well, God has to tell Moses, what is a Sabbath day? Don't do any work. Well, what does it mean, don't do any work? God has to tell over to Moses in much greater detail, this is how I define work, God says, so to speak. So that's what has to happen, because whenever you have anything in writing, it needs to be interpreted. Someone needs to understand what exactly is the intent of the one who wrote it. So the only way to get around a problem where if God had written just things in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, then we'd be left with people debating what exactly was God's intent. So the only way to get around that problem, is to have God explain to Moses, obviously in much greater detail, what exactly he meant. So that could be passed on in all its glory to the rest of the Jewish people, one generation after the next. But there are other reasons as well that are very practical in terms of understanding the need for an oral law. So I want to give over 5 practical reasons why we have an oral tradition. The first is that the moment something's oral, which means that you have to know it by memory, it requires mastery. And mastery is the highest level of knowing something. It's where the knowledge is so much a part of you that you just have it and you can instantaneously answer a question because you've mastered it. And that requires a personal ownership, a relationship to the material so that you own it. And then, of course, that's the only way you could transmit it to the next generation if it's mastered. The moment the mastery standard is lost, then the Jewish people are going to be diminished one generation after the next. So the oral tradition by nature requires mastery. When something's in writing and that's all you have, then people don't feel the need to know it because it's there, it's in a book. But the moment they have to be the carriers of the knowledge, that's when you establish a whole different type of relationship. So that's one thing that's always been, part and parcel of the Jewish people's relationship to learning, is that there's the mastery standard, which changes the whole relationship to the knowledge and the understanding, the wisdom you're giving over. Secondly, another reason for the old tradition is that a live teacher ensures a proper understanding of the material. Meaning if you're just reading from a book, then clearly people can read with different levels of commitment and clarity and understanding, and then we really have no idea of what they're walking away with, what type of understanding and what they can possibly give over to their student or to the child. So having a teacher is going to ensure that they're going to reach the proper understanding, and also they can answer questions, right? You can't obviously ask a question to a book, but once you have a teacher, so that dynamic provides for a much greater level of clarity and potential for clarity. And clearly, there's nothing worse. How does the saying go? Nothing worse than an answer to a question not asked, or something like that. But obviously, you want people to ask questions, to be curious, and then the teacher should be able to then provide the clarity. And a good teacher, provokes the questions, and that's why questioning is so fundamental to Jewish tradition. That's why in Passover, we focus on getting the kids to ask questions, not so much on our answering the questions, but getting them to look and see what is unusual here. So that's another dynamic which comes through an oral presentation of material and an oral relationship to the law that doesn't come through just in writing. Our third reason is it enables the broadest application for generations to come of the law. Meaning, if everything was written down, let's say 3,300 years ago, if that could be, not that I believe that necessarily could be, but if everything was written down, then of course it would not have all the ability to be viable in future generations as mankind advances technologically. Obviously, we have many issues that are relevant today that didn't exist even just 100 years ago, from elevators on Shabbat to biotech to medical issues to all different types of things that just didn't apply back then. So if everything was only in writing, then we'd be very limited in the understanding of how to apply the law. But by presenting a tradition that's oral by nature, and therefore the focus of it is going to be on principles of law and fundamental concepts that then have applications. So then the oral tradition allows for that ability to then be applied in and construed, understood through different ways. And we'll talk about exactly how we know one has an accurate understanding of the oral law and how things are derived from our tradition to present day things. But the oral tradition provides for a plethora of understanding that didn't exist back then. That's the third practical reason why we need to have an oral tradition. The fourth practical reason is it was kept exclusive to the Jewish people, at least for many years. The written Torah was only, the 5 books of Moses was something that was only in the domain of the Jewish people for well over 1,000 years. It was only at the time of the Greeks, when the Torah was translated into Greek, that for the first time the non-Jewish world had access to the 5 books of Moses. Up until then, it was only a book that was understood by the Jews or for those who read Hebrew. But obviously that was a very limited part of the world. Taking the Torah and translating to Greek to give the rest of the world access to it. At that time, Greek was, prominent as a language. That to the Jewish people was a very dark day, a day that we actually mark near a fast day. That was the translation of the Torah into Greek. And unfortunately, as a result of the Torah being accessible, people came along and they misconstrued the meaning of it, and other religions were created, which have been a problem for us because there's a lot of lack of clarity and misunderstanding. So by keeping the oral law oral, at least throughout much broad stroke of our history, that has enabled us to preserve our tradition amongst the Jewish people. And it's interesting to note that it's only after Christianity developed. Remember, Christianity is taking the written Torah as a basis of their religion. And we talk about this in the Crash Course in Jewish History, so please, by all means, go up to the Crash Course in Jewish History and watch that session. But remember, they're taking the written Torah without any of the explanation of the laws that are in the oral tradition. And then they're going to have to somehow rationalize sensibility of things that don't naturally fit their perspective. And they're going to be missing a lot of understanding. So, it was only after the development of Christianity the rabbis felt that now it was safe to put the oral tradition into another format, which was the Mishnah and then the Talmud, which again we talked about in the Crash Course in Jewish History. We'll talk more about here as well. So I'll make this more clear to you, but only when another religion, monotheistic religion, developed off of Judaism, albeit crippled without having this access to this understanding, did the rabbis then feel more secure to put into a format that we could preserve in a written format, although, as I'll explain, maintains the oral nature of the learning. And finally, a fifth reason why the oral law is needed instead of just a written law is that it's the only way to establish a model nation if the entire nation understands, relates to, and is committed to the laws. Meaning, think about it. For many nations, the only people that know the laws are the judges and the lawyers. But everybody else only comes up and bumps into a law when there's some infraction or some dispute with a neighbor or someone else, a client. But for the Jewish people, that's not going to suffice, because if God's vision is to establish a model nation that's going to uphold God's ideals for how man should conduct himself amongst his fellow man and woman, of course, and how they're going to relate to as a society to him, it's only going to work if the entire nation has a relationship to the laws themselves. So if we understand the laws and we relate to the laws, then we're going to be much more committed to upholding the laws, albeit in cases when there's difficulty. Now, it's one thing, to want the law on your side, but often in Jewish laws, especially because of its broad scope, which we're going to get into, the whole nature of Jewish law is to lift us up out of our animal nature and bring out the dignity and the spirit of the divine within us as humans, and together on a national level shine in terms of our moral commitments and being an enlightened nation to the rest of the world. Well, that's only going to happen if we feel connected. And that's why, unfortunately, when Jews feel estranged from this whole area of our law, it's very hard for them to obviously want to keep any laws, which eventually starts to fall away. And if anything, our tradition has taught us that a vacuum of understanding in this area breeds a certain resentment and fear or, antagonism even at times to the thing which is really the lifeblood of the Jewish people, But again, it's only this type of relationship to the law, through understanding it, relating to it, and committing to it, that we're going to be the light unto nations that we're meant to be. So it's the oral tradition which is really the key to it all. And that's why, as I said in the last video, 99% of our traditions locked up in the oral law. It's not locked up, it's accessible for us all, but it's there, and that's where we have to get it, and that's why it's so important. There are other reasons why we have an oral law, which are, I'm going to say, let's say more spiritual, how it impacts us in our mind, our hearts, our souls, which I'm going to get into, but these are 5 things to keep in mind. So let's review. Zip that out of here. We have 5 practical reasons for the oral tradition, the oral law that God gave over to Moses. The first is it requires mastery, which means every Jew is meant to have a personal relationship, sense of ownership of it, because they are going to be the next link in the tradition of the Jewish people, and they have to transmit it to their children, students. Secondly, the live teacher ensures that everybody's getting the proper understanding, and they'll be able to answer questions as they come up, which is the ideal format for learning. Thirdly, it enables the broadest application for generations to come. It's not practical to write down every single law of every single situation that's going to happen throughout history. That doesn't make sense. But the oral tradition enables the understanding of broad concepts and specific principles that then get applied to new situations as they come. Fourthly, it's kept exclusive to the Jewish people. At least it was for well over 1,000 years. And even when Christianity and Islam develop, it's their antagonism to the Talmud and Talmud burnings, and which we discuss also in the Crash Course in Jewish History. It's the oral tradition is really ours, and that's why there's a lot of hatred to it. And finally, it's the only way to establish a model nation is if the entire nation understands, relates to, and is committed to the laws. And that's only going to happen if everybody, from a very young age, is involved in the legal process, understands the principles, has thought about it, has wrapped their head around it, asked their questions, tested it. And that's what happens, generation after generation. So that's what we have in terms of reasons to understand the need for this oral tradition. And this is another important building block of understanding as we go forward in the Crash Course in Jewish Tradition.